attending live here in this virtual session, you're going to be able to get full credit on an assignment that is just now showing up on your Canvas. I will be typing the code word in the chat in a little bit. Otherwise, you will be able to get a 5 out of 10 if you can put a reason for why you weren't able to attend. That's just because literally most of this session is going to be about you attending, so I can see what you know. So first thing that we're going to do here is, I didn't even list objectives here, which I'll go back and add, but we're going to be reviewing how cells get their energy, the parts of plant cells, animal cells, and bacteria cells, and also we're going to be taking questions from you guys. So for a warm-up here, I want you to go to your Canvas. You might have to go to the top bar here and say you don't want to see full screen right now. Go to your biology course, open your grades page, and look at your work. Right, there might be some things that I haven't graded yet, but look at the stuff that is graded and see if there's any questions you have. It could be a quiz question, it could be an assignment question, it could be something that you got right but you're not sure why. Maybe you guessed on it, right? So see if you have any questions whatsoever, because towards the end here, I'm going to take questions from you guys and go over the answers to them. And I will tell you, a lot of those quiz questions show up again on the final test, right? So if you're not getting them now, if you do find out what the answer is and you see it again later, that would be super helpful to you. All right, so I'm going to give you guys 2 minutes right now to just look through your work and see what you have questions about. And I'm going to add objectives while you guys do that. All right, about 30 seconds left. Okay, so we're going to come back to those questions at the end. If you have a question as we're going, feel free to pop it in the chat, and I will be looking at the chat as well. So the first thing that we're going to talk about here is we're going to do a little review question about macromolecules, which was all the molecules in that chart that I provided for you guys. There was also a bunch of reading in some of the lessons about them, but the 4 main macromolecules are carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins, right? And they're called macromolecules because they're big molecules rather than being something really tiny like a water molecule, which is pretty small. So this is a pretty challenging question here. A plant is sitting in soil that is low in nitrogen. Which of the following molecules will the plant have difficulty synthesizing? So first of all, we want to make sure we understand what the question's asking here. What does synthesize mean? To make, right? To build, to make. So plants are constantly building molecules. Where are they getting their nutrients from? The soil, water, the sun, right? So if soil that is particularly low in nitrogen, which one of the following, there's more than one answer that could be true here, will plants have difficulty making? So in order to solve this question, what we really want to do is think about which molecules are these compounds made of. DNA, you probably don't have this memorized, from the chart, but DNA is made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, right? Those are the 4 elements that make up DNA. RNA is the exact same situation. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. And Elizabeth is correct. DNA and RNA are both nucleic acids. So we might, trying to see if I can make like a bracket, but I can't really. I'll just do this. They are both nucleic acids, which is the type of macromolecule that they are. What about an enzyme? What type of macromolecule is an enzyme? P.S. Let's see this. Type a 1 in the chat if you're like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what's going on. Because I'll show you where you can find the answers to this. Okay. I had a feeling. I could sense quietness in the chat. I was like, somebody is confused here. Okay, so this is where you're going to want to find the answers to this. Thank you, Elizabeth. Enzymes are proteins. In Canvas, which I have a million Canvas tabs open, which is pretty much always how my life goes. Right, in biology, in modules, I'm going to leave this writing here because we're going to come right back to that slide. I know a lot of you guys access stuff through the calendar, right? But you do want to check out molecules because I include extra stuff in here. For example, macromolecules mini lesson plus extra credit option, right? There's an extra credit option. I haven't gotten any extra credit emails, so I'm guessing that a lot of you haven't seen it. If you want extra credit, look at that assignment. There's also a macromolecules chart. This is probably the most important extra thing there is. It's a Google Doc, which I'll paste into the chat here. I made this probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago when I first started teaching biology. But basically, it's going to show you all of the major macromolecules, a picture of what they look like, the elements that they're made of, the building blocks, which are a little bit different than the elements, and then examples of what that macromolecule is. This will be a lifesaver to you as we go through cells. So we see carbohydrates here. I will erase this for now because it's driving me nuts here. All right, we have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that make up carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are ring structures. A lot of you guys saw pictures of these when you had to answer that question about cellulose and glucose. Right, the building blocks of carbohydrates are sugars, right? They could be a sugar by themselves or a bigger sugar like a starch. So examples would be starch, polysaccharides, which is like a really fancy word for a big sugar, cellulose, which is what makes up the cell wall, and also chitin, which is the exoskeleton of an insect, right? So if you've ever killed a roach, right, and you hear that crunching sound, you're actually destroying that exoskeleton, which is surprisingly made of a sugar, right, even though it's pretty strong. Obviously, you could crush it, but it's pretty strong for a sugar. We have the lipids, which look like these longer chains, a lot of hydrogens in here. There's different kinds, right? We're not going to go through all the different types of lipids, but they're also made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Notice that the arrangement is going to matter, right? Lipids and carbohydrates are made of the same thing, but they don't look the same. They're arranged very differently. The building blocks for lipids are called fatty acids. And examples of lipids include steroids, like cholesterol, right? You guys have probably heard of cholesterol, testosterone, also oils and fats in the body, and waxes. So earwax is made of fat. We also have our nucleic acids and our proteins, which are much more complex, right? Nucleic acids would be DNA and RNA. You might have seen pictures of them before. They are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Oops, I forgot the phosphorus, which we'll add in. and they're made of something called nucleotides. And then proteins are the most complex. They're made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sometimes sulfur, right? If you don't know what these letters represent, I will type them in the chat for you. So this is getting into some really molecular biology, right? Where we're actually looking at really tiny molecules, chemistry type stuff. Give me 1 second. No. Down. And this is not going to be the most important concept that you learn in biology, but some of the questions in this module are really detailed and specific. So it's important to have this chart. You can reference it. Proteins are made of amino acids, right? A lot of us maybe learned from one of the lessons, Chemistry of Life, I believe, that there are 20 amino acids, right? There's only 20, yet Ariella makes a great point. The protein looks like ribbons, right? It does. It gets folded like that. Proteins go through a lot of steps. First, they're just a long chain. Then they get folded into these crazy shapes, and that's actually what determines their function. One shape is slightly off, and the protein can't work. So a lot of diseases have to do with that proteins aren't folded correctly or they're not making the right shape. Examples of proteins, we have enzymes. We're going to talk a lot more about enzymes later on in the class. The next lab that we do is going to be using a chicken liver to learn about enzymes. We also have receptor proteins, which are on your cells that receive signals, right? So they actually tell the cell what to do. We have our signal molecules themselves, which are called ligands. And we have transport proteins, and then the list goes on and on. There's like a million types of proteins. Right, so this is a little different than when you think of the word protein and you're like, oh yeah, like some meat or some beans, right? In this case, we're talking specifically molecularly. So I believe I did a mini lesson, a PowerPoint also in Canvas about the macromolecules that you could go through to get a little bit more detail about them. But make sure that you're actually checking the modules page as well to see these extra little things that I've put in there, right? I'm not going to make an assignment for that because it's just to help you. But I have, especially when we get to genetics, there's a lot of stuff I put in there to help you. Okay, so back to this really hard question. Now that we all have seen the chart and we can have the chart open, possibly, we know DNA is made of CHON and P, which I got straight from the chart. It's made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus. RNA is made of the same things. Enzymes are a type of protein. They're made of the same things, except possibly also a sulfur. What about antibodies? Do we know what type of molecule those are? Bad ones? Actually, they're good ones, right? So I know it says anti, so you think, oh, it must be a bad thing, right? But actually, the bad things are called antigens. Those are what come in on a bacteria or a virus when it enters your body. Antibodies are what your body releases to attack, right? So they're actually good. They are a type of protein, which means that they are also CHOMPs. It's like the short abbreviation there. But antibodies are really what help you fight off sicknesses. In fact, right now I'm fighting off some awful sickness, which is why I'm a little like sluggish today. I've been taking a ton of zinc and it's been helping, but not feeling 100%. So antibodies are what helps your body fight disease. Sugars are made of CHO, starches are made of CHO, and lipids are made of CHO. I'm going kind of fast here because I spent a lot of time on that chart. You could easily just look at the chart. So now that we've written out what these compounds are made of, what will the plant have a hard time making if there's no nitrogen? I want to see a list in the chat. What will the plant have a hard time making? Okay, DNA, I would agree. There's a nitrogen there. RNA, I would agree. Enzymes, I would agree. Antibodies, I would agree, right? It would still be able to make sugar, starch, and lipid, absolutely zero problem. So what's interesting about this is you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, the plant already has DNA, right? So is it making more DNA? What do you guys think? Do plants actually make DNA on a daily basis? I see a no, a yes with hopeful dots after. The answer is yes, right? And same with you. In fact, every time that you go into the sun cuts up your DNA into a bunch of pieces and it has to be repaired, right? The sun also affects plants' DNA, but basically growth of any kind, you're gonna need new DNA. Your skin cells, right? Millions of your cells fall off every day. You're replacing them with new cells. They have to have DNA in them, right? So DNA is constantly being made and repaired. RNA is the same thing, constantly being made and repaired. Enzymes, I wouldn't say constantly, but they're made pretty frequently. Antibodies are only made when you get a new infection. Doesn't the new DNA have the same makeup as the old DNA? Yes, right? It should. If it doesn't, that's where we have problems because it should just be making a copy. If it's not, right, that's when you get things like cancer, and that's when you end up getting other types of problems with producing enzymes, for example, and other types of diseases, right? So if the DNA is not made correctly, that's when you get disease. Cancer is the most common because then the cells can just keep dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing and nothing can stop them. Sugar, do we make sugar? Yeah, you can, Ariel. But I might mute you when I get ready to talk a lot.
But I have a question though. Shouldn't the DNA maybe slightly do something to be different though? Because we're not like, when we're born, we're not a baby the whole time. We grow up and we change. So
that's a great question. So you have so much DNA in your cells, right? It's compacted up and it gets unwound. Different parts of it code for different things. So when you're a baby, different genes are getting produced. When you grow up, different genes are getting produced. There's also I think it's about 75% of your DNA that doesn't do anything. It's called junk DNA. Scientists don't know what it does, right? Because we really only found out about DNA in the 1950s. So we haven't really studied it that long compared to some other things. So you're right. Not all of the DNA is expressed at the same time, right? So different parts will be expressed at different times. And that's how you're able to grow and change. But the actual sequence of the DNA doesn't change. Just different parts are expressed. That's a great question. Okay, so when you're thinking about macromolecules, make sure you know the 4 types. Make sure that you know what they're made of and the building blocks. It's going to help you understand the parts of a cell and how cells work. Okay, so the next question is kind of open-ended here. This, I believe, was in the chemistry of life lesson and quiz, which I think most people have done by now, but not everyone. How do cells get their energy? And I'm specifically here thinking about a molecule. Okay, so Ariola's taking us to the beginning here. We get our energy from food originally. That's true, right? First of all, we have to have some kind of food. Okay, and then your food gets digested, right? It gets distributed to cells. And then what happens? It's this process called cellular respiration, which makes ATP. So ATP is the energy molecule of a cell. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. I think I got the spacing correctly in there. You don't need to know what it stands for. What you need to know is it means energy. That is energy on a cellular level, is ATP. And we're going to take a look actually at how that molecule works in a second. So ATP, we're going to learn about this process that makes ATP, but for now, we just want to know cells can use ATP to do cellular tasks. Right? That's basically what's happening when you eat. Your food is going to your cells are making energy, and then they're able to do whatever they need to do. Make proteins, divide, do nothing, right? Store fat. Whatever your cells are doing, they use that energy to do. So what's hard about this is that ATP is really tiny, and it's kind of a hard thing to think about, how cells use this molecule. So this is what ATP actually looks like, right? We see that it's made of carbons, oxygens, hydrogens, nitrogens, and phosphates, right? It is very similar to a nucleic acid, but it is not considered a nucleic acid. So we have learned in this class, possibly in previous science classes, I know that they hit this a million times in, like, for example, chemistry and earth science. Bonds of molecules store energy. So all these lines that we see, those represent a bond between two elements. Those store energy. So if we want to release energy from this molecule, all we do is break a bond. And then energy is released. So the way that ATP works is this phosphate group on the end just constantly gets broken off so that energy is released, and then your body rebuilds the molecule, puts the phosphate group back on so that energy is ready to go. Then it gets broken off, energy gets released. Right? It only does this one phosphate group on the end. The other ones don't get broken. The rest of the molecule doesn't get broken. Just the ending group here. So what ends up happening is we get a cycle between ATP and ADP. Does anyone want to take a bold guess on what ADP could stand for? It stands for adenosine diphosphate, because there's only two phosphates. So we're going from 3 phosphates to 2 phosphates to 3 phosphates to 2 phosphates. And that's how the cell uses energy. It's just breaking off that phosphate group and then putting it back on. All right. Type a 1 in the chat if you're kind of understanding some of this molecular stuff. Type a 2 if you want me to repeat what I just said about ATP. This is hard stuff, guys. If you're kind of feeling like I get it a little bit, but not quite, that's fine, right? We're going to keep talking about it. And if you end up studying science further on, you will learn about this stuff over and over, right? And then you're going to understand it even more. All right, so I'm going to repeat. I have 1, 2 here, so I'm going to repeat again exactly what's happening. So we have our ATP molecule. We break this bond here. This phosphate group actually moves away, right? And energy gets released because energy is stored in that bond. That energy can then be used to do anything that the cell needs to do. Fold a protein, make a protein, copy DNA, divide, right? Every process the cell does requires energy. So when that ATP gets broken, it becomes ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, like DI prefix, meaning 2. There's only 2 phosphates there. The cell rebuilds it by adding a phosphate back on, and then we could go through the whole process again. So we're going to learn, oh no, I'm sorry, Ocean. Hopefully it mellows out a little bit. Your Wi-Fi. I hate Wi-Fi problems. It drives me insane. So what's really happening here is the cell is recycling this molecule and using it for energy, right? And we're talking about a tiny amount of energy here. But think about how small this molecule must be, right? You can't see this with your eye. You also can't see this energy, right? It's a tiny, tiny amount. A cell is using this. Think about how small a cell is. So we're going to watch this video. I don't know if you guys have ever seen these crash course biology videos. They're pretty good. Some of them are a little bit too in-depth for this class, but if you're super interested in biology and it's something that you want to study, can I write the abbreviations? Sure. If it's something that you want to study more, good, Ariella, you're exactly right. D like double and T for triple, exactly. Okay, so this is an excerpt from one of these videos. This is maybe a tiny bit more detail than we need, but he's going to talk about ATP and what it does.
Today I'm talking about the energy and the process our cells and other animal cells go through to provide themselves with power. Cellular respiration is how we derive energy from the food that we eat, specifically from glucose, since most of...
And again, we're going to talk about that in the future, right? Cellular respiration is one of the main processes that cells do. And that's the process that Ariella kind of started out for us, which is how we actually get energy from the food into the ATP.
Just what we eat ends up as glucose. Here's the chemical formula for one molecule of glucose. In order to turn this glucose into energy, we're going to need to add some oxygen, 6 molecules of it to be exact. Through cellular respiration, we're going to turn that glucose and oxygen into 6 molecules of CO2, 6 molecules of water, and some energy that we can...
So, again, this is something we're going to learn about soon, but it never is too early to hear about cellular respiration because it's awesome. We're taking a glucose and oxygen. Guess where you're getting your oxygen from? The air. You're breathing it, right? So you breathe your oxygen in. You ate some glucose at some point. Those two things together are going to produce carbon dioxide, which guess what? You breathe out. Water, which can either stay in your body or be released through urine, right? And energy, which is the ATP that we're talking about here.
Use for doing all of our push-ups. So that's all well and good, but here's the thing. We can't just use that energy to run a marathon or something. First, our bodies have to turn that energy into a really specific form of stored energy called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. You've heard me talk about this before. People often refer to ATP as the currency of biological energy. Think of it as an American dollar. It's what you need to do business in the US. You can't just walk into a Best Buy with a handful of Chinese yen or Indian rupees and expect to be able to buy anything with them, even though they're technically our money. Same goes with energy. In order to be able to use it, our cells need energy to be transferred into adenosine triphosphate to be able to grow, move, create electrical impulses in our nerves and brains, everything. A while back, for instance, we talked about how cells use ATP to transport some kinds of materials in and out of its membranes. To jog your memory about that, you can watch that episode right here. Now, before we see how ATP is actually put together, let's look at how cells can cash in on the energy that's stashed in there. Well, adenosine triphosphate is made up of a nitrogenous base called adenine with a sugar called ribose and 3 phosphate groups attached to it. So one thing you need to know about these 3 phosphate groups is that they are super uncomfortable sitting together in a row like that, like 3 kids on a bus who hate each other all sharing the same seats. So because the phosphate groups are such terrible company for each other, ATP is able to do this nifty trick where it shoots one of the phosphate groups off the end of the seat, creating ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, because now there are just 2 kids sitting on the bus seat. In this reaction, when the 3rd jerk kid is kicked off the seat, energy is released. And since there are a lot of...
By the way, it doesn't actually look like that, right? Energy doesn't shoot out of the molecule, but hopefully it's giving you a visual here that breaking that bond is releasing energy, right? And he's right. Those phosphate groups don't want to be next to each other. So imagine if you had to sit next to 2 people that you hated, right? You couldn't wait to be released.
Of water molecules just floating around nearby, an OH pairing, that's called a hydroxide, from one of the H2Os comes over and takes the place of that 3rd phosphate group, and everybody is much happy. By the way?
Okay. So he keeps going because he talks about cellular respiration and a ton of other stuff, right? This is a video called Crash Course Biology, right? It's usually like more for AP biology, but those videos can be helpful if you want to sort of get some more understanding, especially about a lot of this molecular stuff. It never hurts to hear it from multiple people, right? Because he explained it differently than I did. Meanwhile, we're still explaining the same process. Okay, so that was my rant about ATP. Now we're going to do something fun. We're going to do something called Poll Everywhere, where you guys can either text or go to this website, which I will type into the chat, and we're going to make a word web of all the parts of a plant cell. So if you go to that website or you text Jamie Dinsmoo, it's not my whole name, 438, to that specific number, 37607, you can text your answer or you can type your answer into the website, right? And we're going to see your answers appear here. All you're doing is just writing out what are the parts of a plant cell. There was my word. If you don't know the parts of the plant cell, now would be a great opportunity to Google or go in Canvas and look in the lesson about cells or Google a picture of a plant cell. Now, oh boy. Yay! Chloroplast. Cell wall. Amyloplast. Okay, there we go. Now we're getting a bunch of stuff. And what's cool about this is if more than one person says the same word, it makes the word bigger. Look at how happy I am, guys. This is how nerdy I am. I'm like super excited about a word wall of plant parts. All right, so we have a bunch of different stuff. People still adding things here. Really, I'm seeing a lot of cell wall, right, which is important because that's a part that's really specific to the plants, right? We don't have a cell wall. Cell walls are what give plants their rigid structure. I also see a ton of other structures here: cytoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, even though it's separated into two words there, mitochondria, cytoskeleton, ribosomes, nucleolus, nucleus, Golgi apparatus, organelles, vacuoles, lysosomes. Awesome. So, if you don't know, the only one on here I see that we really don't need to know is amnioplast. You don't have to know that for this class. The rest of these parts, you should have at least a vague idea of what they do, right? Remember, this class, you always have access to your notes. So I would recommend that you have a page in your notes that is a plant cell picture that maybe you print out, maybe you draw, and a description of what all the parts are. Because then you can look at it and you can reference that at any time. Okay? So that was the plant cell. Now we're going to look at, I want to let me go to the next one. Okay, now we're going to look at what are the parts of an animal cell. And guess what? They're not the same parts. So don't just copy and paste what you already said. It should be the same link. Yep. Because people are typing and I'm seeing it now. I don't know how Poll Everywhere knows, but it somehow knows. Cell membrane, nucleus. Whoa, cell membrane got huge. This is like science art right now that we're making. Ooh, peroxisome. Shout outs to whoever put that one in. Bonus points if you can tell me what it does in the chat. What's the peroxisome do? Okay, so we're seeing a lot of similar parts, right, but not all the same. For example, I don't see chloroplasts, right? Chloroplasts are definitely not in animal cells. I also don't see a cell wall, right, because we don't find that in animal cells. The only other super obvious difference is that plant cells have something called a large central vacuole, which basically means they have a humongous storage center in the middle of them for water. They store a ton of water. That's what helps them keep their structure, right? Which is why plants can wilt. So you've seen a wilting plant where it's like falling over, right? It's because it needs water. We don't necessarily need water to maintain our structure, right? Obviously, we need water for other things, but your bones and muscles help you maintain that structure. So Juliana says, breaks down long chains of fatty acids through beta oxidation. Sounds super fancy. What does that mean? It breaks down fats, right? The peroxisome is the digestive center in the cell. It breaks down things. Okay, this is looking good. Now the next one's gonna be the hardest, I think. The next one is parts of a bacterial cell. Hint, there's way less. I'm sorry, guys. This is going a lot longer than I thought it would in my mind. I forgot. Biology is my favorite science, so I just ramble about it a lot. Cell wall, yes. Cytoplasm, a gram positive, okay. Or negative. Plasma, good. DNA, good. In bacteria, it's not a nucleus though, right? It's called different things, but it could be called DNA, it could be called a plasmid. A nucleoid, it could be called. Capsule, ribosomes, great. So really, bacteria cells don't have a ton of stuff in them, right? They're mostly a cell wall sometimes. Some of them don't have cell walls with DNA inside and ribosomes. And ribosomes are protein factories, right? They produce proteins. So bacteria usually have a ton of ribosomes. One of my favorite science words ever, flagella. Flagella is a tail. That's a tail on a cell. A lot of bacteria cells have tails to swim. My other favorite science word, by the way, is plasmodesmata, which is the gaps in between plant cells that allows them to exchange nutrients. But flagella is a good second place. And the plural is flagellum. Some cells have multiple tails. Awesome. Okay, so make sure that you know this is going to be our exit ticket, but make sure that you know the key differences between all of these cells, right? So if I were you, I would distinguish somehow in your notes which organelles are in plants, which organelles are in animals, and then which organelles are in bacteria, right? Because they don't all have the same exact ones. So when we talk about parts of a cell, you should always be thinking, well, what cell are we talking about? Are we talking about an animal cell? Or are we talking about a plant cell? Are we talking about a bacteria cell? Okay, so our exit ticket should be available to you in Canvas now. You're just going to complete these two sentences, which is similar to stuff that we already talked about, right? If you didn't attend the session and you answer the questions, you could get a 5 out of 10. If you did attend and you know the code word, which I'm about to type in the chat, which I actually have to look. I made a list of all my code words so I can't forget. So give me 1 second here. If you want, you could see if you have questions that you want to ask me right now, because we're going to have about 10 minutes that I could do questions. So our code word for today is that. No one will ever guess that one. Well, maybe. If they know me really well, they might. So, uh-oh. There we go. Okay. So that's the code word. It's in the chat. Great idea, Destiny. So the exit ticket is in Canvas, but for right now, I just want to take questions from you guys. So if you don't have any questions, you feel good, or you have a question that you think you could figure out on your own, you're welcome to leave. If you think that possibly your question could be answered right now, please pop it in the chat and let me know. By the way, saying like, this quiz question 2 isn't going to be helpful because we all have different question 2s. So tell me what the actual question says. Thanks, Elizabeth. All right, bye, Ocean. So while I'm seeing if anyone happens to populate a question in here, keep in mind, I did post the whose doorknob is the dirtiest results. Did everybody get a chance to look at those? Okay. So you should have gotten a notification in Canvas that they had been posted. Let me pull up the page here and we can look at it really quickly. It's not due until October 3rd, which is next week. I will post a link here in the chat to where it is in Canvas. The exit slip is going to be in the very last module. So I'm in the whose doorknob. I'll just go into one of my other Canvas tabs for a second here. My process is open 55 Canvas tabs and then slowly lower them as I grade for you guys, which is fun times. So let's see. If you go into the course and you go to modules, it should also be on your calendar, but I had it set up so it wouldn't show up until 9:30. So it should have just showed up. And you scroll all the way to the bottom, you will see a module called Virtual Sessions, Labs, and Collaboration Projects. And here you will see Virtual Session 3 check-in. All this gray stuff, you guys shouldn't see that. That's actually hidden from you. That's stuff that I did last year so I can remember what I did. But if you click on that, Virtual Session 3 check-in, right, you should see this, complete the 2 sentences, put the code word to get full credit. And then there's the PowerPoint here as well if you want to go back through the PowerPoint. I'll also be posting the video in a little bit. But the whose doorknob is, there it is. The results were actually pretty interesting. I made a video of me showing all the Petri dishes and talking about it. You guys should watch it. And remember, you're going to be estimating the percentage of the plate that's covered in bacteria. So this was our control group plate. I don't know why. I wonder if I can make this bigger. Yes, I can. The control plate actually had no growth, which is amazing. Those are bubbles from the agar when it was cooling, but there was no colonies on this. So that means it worked, right? The control never had any bacteria and didn't grow any. That's a good sign. The computer lab, we just had a tiny little colony right here. Girls' bathroom never fails to disappoint, insanely huge. It's actually mold and a very tiny bacterial colony here. The staff workroom, none. Surprising. The front doors, we had quite a few colonies, right? A huge one, and then a bunch of little tiny ones kind of spread out around. Miss Christina's room had some beautiful bacteria growth. She was very disturbed. And then this one was the fun dish where I swabbed a bunch of random stuff and people practiced swabbing. As you can see, that one grew quite a bit of bacteria. The boys' bathroom, a little bit of bacteria, not too much. Science lab had quite a bit. A little bit of mold, but quite a bit of bacteria as well. And then this was the sink from the staff workroom, which was a special request by Mr. Scott, our tech person, because he thinks that sink is disgusting and he wanted to prove it using science. Yeah, this swabbing was amazing. Whoever swabbed the sink did a really great job. Yeah, so that was the result. So you're going to be looking at those pictures for your to do your write-up. You could also watch the video if you want to hear me talk about them a little bit more. And you will be using the lab sheet, the lab template to do your write-up. All right, do we have any other questions? It makes you not want to touch any more doorknobs. Yeah, I agree. Do we have any more questions about assignments, where to find something, a quiz question or an assignment question that was hard? How about a statement? A statement for what? For me? About what?